Welcome to Curator at the Museum. On display on our shelves, we don't have paintings or sculptures or even ancient artifacts. Our exhibit pieces are Lego sets. Now, as an adult collector, my point of view on Lego is that there's much of a work of art as a playable toy. Something that can be displayed, shared, and admired. The adult line of Lego sets have had such a meteoric rise in the last several years, which brings us to what we do on this channel. Our museum display pieces deserves effort, care, and attention to keep them looking as pristine as possible. Our films will take you through the work we do at this museum in service of that very goal. So hope you enjoy, and thank you for watching. Here at the museum, we think that every single Lego set has a story to tell. And that's kind of why this chapter is called Stories at the Museum. Going over the interesting build features and details that you might not know of, and also the kind of stories that they might be hiding within. Everybody has a different aspect of Lego that draws them in. Whether it be the super bright and colorful store, or the idea of putting together something with 100 different pieces to create something new, or being fans of the original IP that influenced that particular set. For us at the museum here, we are drawn to large-scale sets. The ones that make you stop, just take a few seconds, and stare. On today's Stories at the Museum, we will dive into the history and lore behind one of these seemingly larger-than-life sets. Any Star Wars fan would be hard-pressed to say what vehicle is the Star Wars vehicle. The representation of the flagship ship of the entire Star Wars universe. There are too many answers and too many possible combinations of answers. Here at the museum, we'll eventually be able to tell the stories of every single one of the Star Wars flagships, ships that we have here. Well, only if it has a Lego set of it. For today, we will be looking at the legendary Imperial Star Destroyer. In Star Wars lore, the Imperial Star Destroyer was the chief warship of the Imperial Navy, and a symbol of the power of the Empire. The sheer menace of these ships would cast a literal and figurative shadow over the Empire's subjects, enemies, planets, other ships, what have you. A single Star Destroyer was feared enough to be considered capable of overwhelming a small planet, while several Star Destroyers could be considered a valid threat to any planet with a major civilization. An interesting fact to note is that the early versions of the Star Destroyers were used during the Clone Wars. This Venator-class Star Destroyer was equally as well regarded by fans. Measuring over 17 inches, 44 centimeters high, 43 inches, 110 centimeters long, and 26 inches, 66 centimeters wide. This is actually not the first iteration of the Imperial Star Destroyer in Lego form. A UCS version predated this, coming out in 2002. I can't overstate how insanely cool this set must have been when it came out. A ship of this unique shape and size, truly it's hard to comprehend. Needless to say, I had a similar reaction when seeing the new UCS Star Destroyer for the first time in store. The iconic first shot of the New Hope showcased the immense size of the Star Destroyer. The Tantive 4 looked absolutely tiny in comparison. Escape seemed futile, setting the tone of the rest of the film and establishing the overwhelming might of the enemy our protagonists were faced with. Early drafts of the Star Wars script called for 4 Star Destroyers to be chasing the Tantive 4. However, complexity and budget costs ultimately resulted in the single massive Star Destroyer that we see in the final picture. ILM built a 91 centimeter long, 36 inches, shooting model of the Star Destroyer using a model building technique called kit bashing, which is pretty well known amongst model builders. The size of the model was actually pretty close to the Lego UCS set, What's interesting is that the Tantive 4 model from ILM was not to scale to the Star Destroyer. In fact, lined up next to each other, the Tantive 4 would be just about half the length of the Star Destroyer. This would be the first of thousands of special effects shots achieved by ILM through the production of the original trilogy. This particular shot made use of motion control photography by way of a new camera that was invented for this film. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the actual details of this set. So I'm going to get a lot of the names wrong, so I'm going to apologize in advance. We see the bow detailing on the very top of the front of the bow, and you see a lot of the greebling detail that's going to be pretty predominant throughout this set. So you have some rare smooth paneling right here above some more piping detail and greebling too. This turbo laser turret rotates a little bit, but it doesn't rotate too much, I suppose. The lower superstructure here is right above the middle of the hull. And then you see more of the greebling that's always going to be just adorning this entire set. And you have the 3 rotating turrets. There's one more rotating turret too, but we'll take a look at that a little later. Rotating the Star Destroyer around so that we can look at the Tantive 4. There's a small connector to the Star Destroyer with this clear piece. And you see the main hull, the engines and radar array that's on this actual Tantive 4. It's a small set, but it's pretty well detailed. You see some flap details on the very stern, and most of the lower hull is pretty studded. There's a TIE fighter in the actual hangar bay itself, which is an awesome touch. I recall as a kid, after watching the Star Wars films, being absolutely obsessed with those large picture books that showed the cross sections of Star Wars ships. I think they made these kind of books for a lot of different shows and movies. In comparison to seeing the select interior sets in the films, this was a unique way to view all the details of these ships. I could truly appreciate the scale and size of the Star Destroyer through these cross sections. The Imperial Star Destroyer boasts several mind-blowing statistics. It measured 1,600 meters with a weight of 40 million tons. The crew consisted of 9,700 stormtroopers with 9,235 officers and 27,850 crew members. The Star Destroyer operated a whole fleet of smaller starships, 72 TIE fighters, 20 AT-ATs, 30 AT-STs, 15 ITTs, and 8 landing shuttles. As for weaponry, the Star Destroyer was equipped with 6 turbo laser turrets and 2 heavy ion cannon turrets. At the height of the Empire's power, there were over 25,000 Imperial Star Destroyers in existence, all built from the Empire's manufacturing planet. The more and more I read up about the lore behind the Star Destroyer, the more unbelievable the triumph of the rebellion feels. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the superstructure elements of the Star Destroyer. You get a nice shot below from here. There's some stern greebling detailing that we've discussed before. The mid of the superstructure here extends pretty far out to the sides of the Star Destroyer itself. You can see this greebling along the sides of the different levels of the superstructure, and the top of the superstructure is sloped in 2 different pieces, and there's not much of a gap in between them, so it looks pretty awesome. The top level of the superstructure here is a little bit more detailing too, and greebling as always. So the top panel is obviously pretty much all studded. There's not many smooth pieces here on this set at all, actually. And towards the rear of the superstructure, you have some additional greebling detailing. You see different pieces and piece usage, which makes this set very interesting, especially during the build. Rotating to the rear of the Star Destroyer, you see the 3 engines, and you see a little bit more of those flap details. I don't know if they're actually flaps, but that's what it looks like to me. And you see a little bit of that command center tower right in the middle. So I do know some portions of this command center tower. There's a tractor beam at the very top, and you'll have a little bit more greebling on the sides too, but it's relatively smooth, but not too many other details. I recall a recent film example of the Star Destroyer in action that really cemented itself in my mind, and it's the scene in Rogue One where we see our protagonists arrive in Jeddah. where an Imperial Star Destroyer is parked right over the city. What strikes me about this scene is it's one of the rare times where we see a Star Destroyer not in space. The scale of it looks so much more impressive when it's flying pretty close to the surface of the planet rather than when it's in orbit. You get a sense of scale with other landmarks and such. Science fiction always has some basis within scientific fact, although pushing the boundaries of what we know as reality is kind of the point. An apt example is none other than the concept designer for the Imperial Star Destroyer. Colin Cantwell, who worked for NASA in the 1960s and subsequently served as a concept artist for 2001: The Space Odyssey, and then ultimately went to Star Wars. He helped design many of the famous Star Wars ships, including the Star Destroyer. And if you ever thought about what it would take to build a Star Destroyer in our time, Forbes actually did the math to figure it out. So finishing up with the other smaller details of the Star Destroyer, you see the top of the tractor beam has some, kind of greebling details too. Turning it around so we can look at the front of the command center, you see a lot of detailed greebling here. And some of the top panels of the command center does have, you guessed it, more greebling. So a lot of different piece usage here on this particular set. Makes the build pretty interesting. Now on the sides of the command center, the paneling is relatively smooth. Like we said before, there's not too many greebling elements here, and I think that's kind of nice, keeping it pretty clean, though I imagine on the actual Star Destroyer there was a lot more piping and details like that. On the rear of the command center tower, you have some vent tube details and some smaller greebling elements too. Then now we can take a look at the actual engines themselves. So rotating the Star Destroyer here so you can get a better look. There's 3 primary large engines and 4 smaller secondary engines. Not really 100% sure which functions are which, but we can, at least take a guess, I suppose. So the large engine has some exhaust details and a nice engine core piece. The smaller engines also have a fair amount of details, but definitely not as large as the large engine. So we'll go ahead and turn the Star Destroyer back around. The Imperial Star Destroyer is sure to take its place in the upper echelons of UCS Star Wars sets. However, it's not just the size and the build that makes this set a legend, but the lore and the stories behind it. The vivid imagery of the Star Destroyer overwhelming the frame whenever it appeared still has a solid place in my memory. It may not be the Star Wars ship, but we can call it the Empire ship. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Every single LEGO set has so many different little details that not necessarily hidden, but it's a little bit hard to see them when you're just looking at them from above. So this chapter is called Exhibits at the Museum, and here we're going to highlight and show you every little aspect of this set through beauty shots. I'm sure that not many other LEGO collectors like doing this, but for us here at our LEGO museum, what we like doing is maintaining sets, which means dusting them and then checking to make sure that there aren't any parts that have been broken off. As always, we'll begin with the Dyson soft brush head, carefully working our way around each side of this magnificent, towering set. Now, what's fascinating about this particular model is that there was an earlier, smaller version released back in the early 2000s, and it was a fair bit more compact, probably about half a foot smaller. But when I first laid eyes on this larger, updated version, I was truly in awe. I remember thinking, how could they possibly make a set this large? I mean, each year LEGO Star Wars would one-up themselves with larger and larger UCS sets. However, I still believe that none of the other sets that I've seen in person had me as taken aback as seeing this set at the LEGO store. You'll notice that the set moves quite a bit as we go along with our initial dusting pass, which is a bit unusual for me because I typically keep the turntable pretty steady. But this set is a little bit more delicate, so I'm handling it with extra care. That's where the power duster comes in. I mean, helping us reaching the smaller, harder to access areas that the brush can't quite manage. The brush is fantastic, don't get me wrong, for removing the dust from the exterior, especially with all the studs and detailed areas covering the surface. Now, when it comes to the rear of the set, let's just say it's a bit of a challenge. The intricate details are tough to clean because they're delicate and somewhat tricky to handle. This is one of those sets where you really have to be mindful when building or moving it. The newer UCS Venator set, on the other hand, addresses many of these build issues, offering a much sturdier structure. Even the stand on the Imperial Star Destroyer can feel a little bit wobbly, but the Venator stand is pretty rock solid. Of course, this set still stands as one of the most impressive Star Wars models in our museum. Actually, scratch that. This is easily one of the cornerstone sets in the museum. Let's take a closer look at some of the finer details. So we'll go ahead and start our second phase of the maintenance procedure, which is double checking all of the little, bits, details on the build to make sure no pieces have fallen off and that everything is still sturdy. LEGO sets can become a little bit loose, not really over time, but typically when you're building it, you're not necessarily thinking about trying to push all the pieces as firmly together, so sometimes, pieces fall off and whatnot. So the tip of the bow is very delicate, and actually most of this set's hulls are going to be very delicate, so doing a little bit of a gingerly push with our fingers just to make sure that all the panels are still on. They connect to the actual Technic superstructure inside. It's kind of a loose connection. It's not the greatest, but, we just do the best that we can here. So the lower hull panels, I'll be honest, this is the part that I check the least, honestly, but I just know that if they are, if the hull panels have disconnected from the actual Technic superstructure, it would sag quite a bit, so this is just kind of double checking to make sure that there's nothing really sagging all that much. So turning around to the actual engines themselves, these three engines are the most, let's say, a little bit frustrating. The most frustrating part of this set when it comes to longevity, because they are not on very securely. They do not, they don't stick on very well. They can get knocked over pretty easily as they start to sag on their own weight. I believe the Venator actually really improved upon this design, so I'm excited to see that in the future. But the smaller engines, they're perfect. They're on, they're on for good. The Technic connections, they're pretty good. But the giant engines, they're really just on through studded connections. So, as you know, it can start to sag and fail over time. So the overall rear of the Star Destroyer has quite a bit of detailing here. We just mainly checked the large engines to be sure, because all the other smaller bits and pieces of this rear. You know, if you push a little bit in any different way, pieces fall off. So we just do our best to just go over the top hull portions. There's those little flap details that we like to just push, make sure that they're on tight. Turning the Star Destroyer one more time. Actually, we're going to be turning it a lot more times. But let's take a look at the very front. So the lower part of the superstructure, it's actually pretty secure, if I'm being honest. Like it can detach a little bit, so we're going to show you that a little bit later. But the overall superstructure here is pretty sturdy, so we can just like push on it a little bit just to make sure all the greebling pieces are still on pretty well. And moving on to the hull portion, the aft hull, stern hull, aft hull. I think it's aft hull, and we're just gonna keep it that way. You see all the greebling elements on the sides of the superstructure here. So just using our thumb to push in to make sure that none of the pieces are, falling off. Actually, off camera, I saw that one piece was a little bit like skew, so went ahead and fixed that too. There's some smooth elements here that, kind of a nice little touch. And moving on to the upper superstructure. So for up here, same thing with the superstructure itself. It's pretty sturdy. So just pushing along the sides to make sure that all the greebling elements are on there all good. The lower superstructure, we took a look at that a little bit earlier, but we'll, just push on the top panels. It's interesting, like with greebling elements, they look great, and you kind of have to make sure that they're on pretty tight, but the moment that one falls off, you have no idea where it went. So it's a long trek to go get the actual the instruction booklet and trying to find out where exactly that piece came from. This center tower here has a lot of nice detailing in the back. Fortunately, we don't have too many loose pieces except for that middle like piping detail. That one's the only kind of loose piece that we have to worry about. And behind the command center, you have the radar array, which has like nice little detailing pieces too. And then behind that, you have the kind of panels, rear panels of the command center. So making sure that everything's on tight, pushing down that radar array too. Luckily, everything up here, that's kind of far away is like, being in the middle of the ship, it's hard to kind of knock into those things. So, the side hulls are pretty much the primary portion of this set that's more difficult to deal with. Tower panels. So on the sides of the command tower, you have very nice smooth panels. These are pretty strong because, they're kind of holding up the entire command center and it's part of the entire Technic skeleton that's inside this set. And you have a lot of greebling elements in the very front. You see some pieces are a little bit askew. I think I noticed that. I primarily notice it when I'm watching the footage back, so forgive me for not straightening them. Oh, I did straighten them. Great, perfect. And yeah, there's a lot of fun detailing up here. That tractor beam at the top too moves a little bit, so just pushing the pieces together. Now we're going to get to some of the moving elements of this set just to make sure that they work well. So all of these 4 turrets rotate independently of one another. They're not attached to anything, they just rotate pretty freely. There's that articulating turret on the midship side of the hull that have, 4 little gun pieces. Looks pretty awesome. Let's turn it around so that we can take a look at the top of the command center, which has that tractor beam. I'm not really sure if it's supposed to be posable like that, but it's built like on that with a movable piece, so we're just gonna show that anyway. I'm pretty sure it's not meant to be moved or posed, but what can you do? And then we're gonna start to remove the movable portions of the superstructure here. So the first portion is the lower superstructure here. You kind of have to like jimmy it free a little bit. It's a little bit hard to get off. It's stuck together with Technic pins. And you see that red handle piece in the middle? That's designed so you can actually carry the Star Destroyer. Yeah, you don't really see too much inside. It's just, you just see the Technic skeleton. But we just take them off just to make sure that they're able to be taken off. And whenever you're moving the set, you have to take off those panels anyway. It's a little bit of a more difficult process doing that. So you have the small Tantive 4 that's connected to it. You can also mount it underneath in the hangar bay too, which we don't really do because I like seeing it next to it. Technically, it should be in front of the Star Destroyer like in the New Hope, but we do what we can. So I'm going to go ahead and put the hull pieces back on. It is pretty difficult. It's not the easiest thing to put on. Like there's two connectors on the front and the rear that you have to kind of align pretty perfectly. And whenever I'm doing this, I'm always going to knock like one greebling piece over. Let's see if I'm able to not do that today, but it might surely happen. I really wish there was a better way to carry this set, but the stand itself is pretty wobbly. Doesn't really inspire you with that much confidence. So it helps to use the actual handle itself. Also, even when you're using the handle, it kind of center of balance is not where the handle is, so it's kind of more in the rear of it. So what have you. It's a difficult set to move around, and any collector who has this set knows that to be absolutely true. So now that we have the lower superstructure portions on too, just have to make sure that all the pieces are correct, and then we can move on to our final step of maintenance. We've reached the end of our journey, so it's time to put away the electric duster, though of course I left it out again. What can I say? When I used to do this entire set just with a maker brush, that was an experience. It took forever, but it's nice to have some last minute touch-ups by using it again. The Dyson brush helps a lot, but there's something satisfying about going in by hand one last time for our last brushing. Just making sure the turrets are all facing forward. They love to shift around while cleaning. And as we move the Star Destroyer a little in front of the camera, we'll take a final check at the back. Mainly the engines. I try not to mess with them too much because, if they fall off, it's a whole process to get back on, and I'd rather not pause a video to fix it. Keeping your LEGO sets in your collection clean is kind of a monumental task in and of itself. But here, we go a little bit of a step further. Any kind of LEGO set that hasn't been dusted in a while, sometimes the dust can get a little bit caked on. And by that point, you kind of have to go a little bit more thorough with how you actually clean. So this chapter is called Conservation at the Museum, and here we're going to restore one particular LEGO set. Let's be honest, I'm someone who definitely prefers the larger scale sets. There's something about the grandeur of them that really resonates with me. I'm not as much of a fan of the microscale models, but when I see the microscale Tantive 4 sitting next to the Star Destroyer, the sense of scale is just incredible. Perfectly captures that iconic scene where the Tantive 4 is being pursued by the Star Destroyer. Now let's dive into the cleaning of the hull of the Star Destroyer. As much as we've been fortunate with the previous sets we've cared for, most of which didn't have many studs on the exterior, this one is a different beast altogether. The Star Destroyer is far from a smooth model. That's actually one of the things I love about it. It's gritty, it's greebled, and the amount of detailing is phenomenal. The studs really bring that texture to life, but when it comes to cleaning, well, let's just say it's not exactly a breeze. Cleaning all those studs is a time-consuming process, and making sure to get into every little crevice is no small task. That's why we're taking you along for the ride, so you can see exactly how we go through each step. Water tends to leave marks when it dries. By using the cloth, we can avoid those pesky water spots and ensure the hull stays relatively pristine. Let's move up the hull a bit now. Same story with the studs. Wish there was a little bit more smooth pieces here and there, but as I said before, do love those studded details. It's part of what gives its set its character. Another story about this set is I remember seeing the earlier version of the Star Destroyer at a friend's house. He was an incredible LEGO Star Wars collector, and you have no idea how jealous I was that he had this set displayed right next to his bed on its own stand. It looked stunning, and I dreamt of the day where I might be able to have a similar kind of impressive set. It took some time for LEGO to release an updated version of the Star Destroyer, and, well, I was fortunate enough to acquire this version for the museum, and it's definitely one of our cornerstone pieces. We brought it into the collection early on, and it's been such an iconic part of our overall display and museum. The Imperial Star Destroyer is one of the most famous, steadfast ships in sci-fi movie history. And having that piece of history here with us it's truly special. As we shift the angle here, we'll continue working through the studded pieces on the right side of the hull from our perspective. And from this angle, you can really begin to appreciate the start of the top of the superstructure. It's made up of these smaller levels that gradually lead up to the very top control room. I remember reading, or maybe it was a meme I saw about the set, calling it a $700 gray triangle. And honestly, they're not wrong. But for a $700 triangle, this thing is absolutely magnificent. Triangle. It's got so much depth, detail, and for a set this large, it's a collector's item. That's what the prices of these sets are going to be. If you look closely underneath, just beneath the section that we're cleaning, you'll catch a glimpse of one of the little gun turrets. You can also see the greebling details along the side. The lighting here is a little bit dramatic, but that's the fun of shooting LEGO UCS sets. Everything looks better when the lighting is as intense as possible. And these raised pieces on the sides of the hull, they really add a layer of depth, making the model feel more dynamic. I know it might sound odd to say that about LEGO since all the sets are inherently three-dimensional, but some designs really stand out more than others in terms of how visually they pop. I don't always show it in every shot, but I promise you it's an essential part of the process. Without it, we lose out on the finer details, and that kind of defeats the purpose of all this care that we're putting into the cleaning. We're now transitioning to the left side of the superstructure, or rather, just beneath the superstructure, where all the turrets are located. These turrets are highly movable, which, in the theory, is great. But in practice, when it comes to cleaning, it's a bit of a challenge. The slightest touch, and they shift just a bit. So you have to go back and adjust them to make sure everything is pointed in the correct direction. By everything, I just mean the turrets. But that movability is one of the things that makes LEGO so unique. It's a core part of what sets LEGO apart. Everything is adjustable, giving you the freedom to tweak and pose it in your own way. Now, when it comes to all the studs, well, there are plenty of them here. We'll continue to work through each one, cleaning the tops, sides, and around the edges. I found Q-tips to just be my favorite tool for this kind of detailed cleaning. Sure, they were just a little bit smaller, they'd be perfect, but hell, they still do the trick. I used to use paintbrushes for cleaning between the studs, but after a while I realized they weren't quite as effective. The Q-tips offer just more precision and consistency, although you do have to replace them as you are using them in cleaning. As we move towards the final section of the right side of the hull, you'll notice the tail end on the far right. And of course, there's that dramatic lighting again. Sorry, it's kind of my thing. I love working with this kind of lighting because it brings so much depth and energy and just creative look to the model. It's all about showcasing the studs and details in a more dynamic way. Now let's shift our focus to the superstructure itself. As you can see, there are many more smooth elements here, which certainly makes cleaning a bit easier. But even with those smoother sections, the greebling and the small details are still all around. Sure, you've got your studs, but
There's such an impressive variety of pieces used here, and it really elevates the design. It's hard to fully describe how intricate it is, but that's part of what makes this set so remarkable. And if you look closely, you can catch a glimpse of the turret on the right-hand side. There's a little fun Easter egg right there. One of the coolest features is that you can remove the superstructure to reveal a built-in handle, which actually allows you to carry the model. The superstructure comes apart in 4 distinct pieces, and they're both attached pretty securely to the Star Destroyer itself. It's a surprisingly reinforced handle, though the weight distribution is something else. The Star Destroyer is very back heavy, while the front is surprisingly light, which can make it very tricky to balance when you're moving it around. As a result, moving this set is quite difficult. I think we've mentioned this before, but there's a small turret on the side of the Star Destroyer between the top and the bottom hull plating. You'll find a lot of greebling elements that make up a sidewall. This area typically doesn't accumulate that much dust because it's mostly covered, but we'll still give it a light pass with the Dyson soft brush head. That works well here. There are a few spots though where we need to go in a bit more precisely with our Q-tip to clean around the details. As we move on to what I'm not entirely sure is called the cockpit or the main control station on the Star Destroyer, it's the top part of the superstructure where the radar dishes are located, along with even more greebling details. This shape is definitely iconic, and it really stands out in this set. And as we shift it to a lower angle, you can definitely get a sense of its positioning relative to the rest of the ship. It sits high within the superstructure, giving it a great vantage point over pretty much the entire model. Now this radar piece at the top, it's not exactly a radar dish, but it does have cool functionality. It can move forward and backwards. I'm not sure if this feature has any purpose in the movies, but it's a neat detail that adds to the authenticity of this set. As we move to the rear of the Star Destroyer, we come to the 3 massive engines, which are easily my favorite part of the set, though it's a bit of a love-hate relationship. The engines are placed in a way that makes them prone to being knocked off accidentally. They're not really mounted together, it's just stud-on-stud contact. 4x4 studs on 4x4 studs. While it's a decent connection, it doesn't take much of a bump for them to fall off. And then there are all these tiny thruster engines scattered around the back. These are connected with fairly delicate joints so that when you're dusting with the Dyson soft brush or even using the blower, you have to be extra cautious. A lot of these small pieces can easily get dislodged, and putting them back in place is no easy task. In fact, if parts of this rear section do fall off, you may need to remove some of the hull panels on top of the Star Destroyer to access the interior and fix anything in the back area. Eventually, we'll get to the bottom portion where the Tantai 4 is housed, essentially the hangar bay. This area is especially tricky to fix without disassembling parts of the set, so we'll have to be careful when we get there. So we'll do some finishing touches here with the Q-tip before turning the Star Destroyer to a different position. The rear of the control tower also requires a bit of attention, so we'll grab a Q-tip and gently go over all the rear elements. There's some excellent greebling in this area, though it's a little hard to see due to the dramatic lighting I prefer to use. That's just part of the charm here at the museum. We'll take a careful pass and remove as much dust as we can from this section. Alright, now that we've flipped the Star Destroyer to the other side, we can repeat the entire process, this time on the right-hand side of the Star Destroyer. Moving the Q-tip between all the studs, I use a little circular or twisting motion to get into the gaps. I found it to be a bit more effective, and it also looks better on camera, but feel free to disagree if you think I should just dab it instead. The hull panels on each side are nearly identical. Well, no, I lied. There are a few differences between the left and the right sides of the Star Destroyer hull. It's a nice touch because otherwise the build might seem a little bit too repetitive. And then, of course, there are the turrets. They shift with even the slightest bit of movement. Cleaning all these studs takes time, but If you only do it once or twice a year, it's really not too bad. With our current lighting setup, it's a bit easier to see all the detailed greebling across the 3 levels that make up this top superstructure. It's relatively smooth, not too many studs here, so cleaning goes a lot faster. This section usually gets plenty of attention with a duster or Dyson brush head, so there's not much dust buildup on this side, or on the other side for that matter. No turrets up here either, and like I mentioned earlier, this whole structure lifts up to reveal the handle, making it possible to carry the UCS Star Destroyer and move it wherever you need to go. The most challenging part of moving this set, by far, is when you actually have to pack it up. Finding a box that fits this set is already a struggle, but transporting it in a car, that's a whole different challenge. The stand for this set isn't really the most stable. It's a bit wobbly, not very structurally stiff, so if you're going to be driving with it, be prepared. It's going to shift, tilt, and, hopefully it doesn't fall, but it might fall, so definitely not a set you want to take on a bumpy road. Alright, we've made our way back, well, almost, to the front of the Imperial Star Destroyer. This has definitely been one of the most enjoyable sets to work on for conservation, especially when figuring out how to shoot it, light it, the works, the scale, the perspective, the contrast, the sharp lines. It's just an impressive model, and playing around with different lighting setups is always a fun challenge, even when the purpose is for cleaning. There's something meditative about dusting, getting into a rhythm. Back when I used to maintain all the sets in the museum without actually making any videos for them, I'd go through maybe 20 or 30 in one day every couple months, and I really picked up a lot of tricks along the way, like using the vacuum brush heads or electric blowers to be more efficient. This isn't meant to really be a how-to guide, though. There are plenty of those out there. It's just taking a look at the process we use here at this museum, making sure these models stay clean enough to be properly appreciated without going that overboard. Just get the dust out of there. Just enough so, they look like, we don't want them to look like they've been buried in dust for years. I think one of my inspirations for that deep, low red tone you see in the lighting it's probably a little bit obvious. It looks a bit like a lightsaber, doesn't it? It's just something about that dramatic flair that it adds, making the scene feel more dynamic and intense. And that's it. We've made it to the very tip of the Star Destroyer. Here, we'll go over the last few studs on the hull before taking one final pass just along the sides, just to catch any remaining dust. There's usually not much buildup here, but it's always worth a last check. And with that, we'll take one last look at the Star Destroyer in the conservation room. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe for more cleaning videos and check out the other kinds of LEGO content that we have on this channel, and we'll see you next time.